Hello, everybody. Once again, we're going to awkwardly click our way through another chapter of our textbook. This is chapter 37. So this is going to be the one where we are ending empires, kind of the consequences of Western influence in various parts of the world. We're mostly going to be talking about Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So let's move on to the layout of what we're going to look at today. So in chapter 37, we're going to talk about South Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and then communism in Asia. So these are kind of like the four basic big picture questions I want you guys to be thinking about. Remember, we're kind of looking more at themes during these video lectures. Let's see. Which countries gained independence through violence, negotiations, so basically peaceful negotiations? How did they set up independent governments? Like, kind of what did those new countries look like? And how did cultural ideals unite people across borders? We've got sort of pan cultural movements. And what is going on with China? So we're going to talk about China kind of towards the end. South Asia. So South Asia, we're going to be talking about like what happens with the subcontinent of India, former British colony. All right, so India, officially independent in 1947. So after nearly a century of being a British colony, they are independent. What their government looks like afterwards, they have a prime minister. His name is Nehru. They have a parliamentary government. They are technically a democracy. When they are first independent, they kind of get involved. They try to stay out of the Cold War, and they choose something called the third path. And that is, instead of joining a side as a brand new country, they're going to remain politically neutral in the Cold War. So they're not going to get involved with communists. They're not going to get involved with aggressive democratic countries. They're choosing a third path. The largest impact of Indian independence is what we call partition. So after it's independent, there's a very large movement of the Muslim minority in India, and that is to officially create an independent Muslim state. And so we're going to create Pakistan. We've got Jinnah is the largest the leader of this movement, and they advocate for a separate state that is Muslim. They did fear that being in a country newly independent with a Hindu majority, that Muslims would not be feeling as equal in society and politically. This isn't that peaceful, okay? They intended it to be, to avoid violence, but it did not go down that way. So what happens is people living in northern India, what was to become Pakistan, if you were a Hindu, you got to move out, okay? You got to go south. And kind of similar thing that would happen in the more southern parts of India. If you're a Muslim, you got to go north. And so we've got 10 million refugees having to be displaced to go to their, appropriate countries based on their religions. And within this, of course, we've got lots of violence. And they estimate that over 500,000 people were killed during partition. It was a very, very violent movement. Of course, it also completely disrupts just everyday life for these people that have to be forced across the border somewhere. So we've got the formation of Pakistan up in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. But we're also going to be creating eventually some other independent countries based off of partition as well, like Bangladesh and Burma, coming out of this partition. So what happens to India once they are independent? Now we've got all these different countries in South Asia. We go through a process called the Green Revolution. So this is kind of what we term the third agricultural revolution. We have talked about two previous agricultural revolutions in this course. The first one being prehistoric, when man discovers agriculture. The second one being kind of the 18th century, using technology and a little bit of science to increase production. This is the 20th century agricultural revolution. So we are now using more and more science, including the use of pesticides. This is called the Green Revolution. This increases agricultural yields, especially in third world countries, but India is impacted by the Green Revolution, and there is quite a bit of population growth. So what we have out in the rest of India, there's something called the emergency. This is kind of like a political movement where they've identified that they've got to slow population growth. Indira Gandhi is in charge during this time, and she actually is using forced sterilization out in the agricultural, like rural areas of India, where they are basically taking women and making them sterile so they cannot have more children. This is kind of a dark period in Indian history. Go ahead and watch the crash course, Decolonization. They will talk a lot about partition and kind of what's happening, especially in South Asia. So we're going to move on to Africa. There's kind of two ways that countries gained independence, and that was through negotiations. The more peaceful way, and that would be Ghana did that. But there was also a lot of violent ways that they were gaining and fighting for independence, like Algeria and Kenya. Two cultural movements that come out of this time period of decolonization would be Pan-Africanism. That's the connection of basically the African diaspora that had been created the previous century, many different populations that had moved out or been forcibly removed out of Africa, feeling connected through like their shared African heritage, and negritude, which is the reaffirmation of African civilization. And what that means is kind of like the celebration of everything that people of African descent have done for the world. And even when you go on to study like American history, you're going to find different versions of how people have been celebrating people, African culture, including like, African American culture in the United States. Let's look at South Africa, because this is a really good example of what happens when a country is independent, newly independent. So South Africa had gained independence, but even while they were under British rule, most of this had begun. So in the early half of the 20th century, the conditions were that, most of the land went to the white minority in South Africa. So about less than 20% of South Africans had white ancestry. And while 80% of them were indigenous Africans, and those indigenous Africans were basically forced into tribes. Some of them were kind of made up tribes that weren't actually logically based in cultural heritage. And they were kind of put out into homelands and even Black neighborhoods. And this was like the minority of land that was given to the majority of people. They were not allowed to participate in government. The government had banned the African National Congress, which was the political party that was growing in the mid 20th century. And Nelson Mandela was part of the African National Congress. He is an activist. And in the 1960s, he was jailed because this is a political party that wanted people of indigenous African descent to actually be involved in South African politics. When he was freed in the 90s, he becomes the first Black president of South Africa. And in 1994, they have officially ended the process and that barred the majority of South Africans from participating in South African government. Latin America. So let's look at what's happening in Latin America. This is kind of a continuity of what we discussed in the last time period, especially when we're talking about imperialism, what happened with the political aspirations and economic aspirations of the United States. So Latin America. We've got the continuity of militarism. Okay, it's kind of like caudillo rule type stuff that we've talked about before. Dictators. Argentina was led by Juan Perón. He was famous for being a very brutish leader. The only kind of benefit that Argentina got from his rule was through his wife, Eva Perón. Now, she's over here on the right. And if you are interested, because I know some of you got to see me or hear me talk about like Vladimir Lenin's body, I get interested in what happens to corpses, I guess. And we can look at the story of Eva Perón's body. She died in 1952, but she was not permanently buried until 1976. So you can read about the saga of poor Eva Perón. She did a lot of things for Argentina's poor population, and she was extremely well loved, whereas her husband, not so much. Communism in Cuba was a direct consequence of American involvement in Latin America. So we've got Fidel Castro took over Cuba. They are allied with the USSR. They allow the USSR to bring in missiles, and we've got that global nuclear crisis we talked about in 1936. Chapter 36. The U.S. is going to continue its economic interest in Latin America. The best examples of that would be their involvement in Guatemala and Nicaragua. So let's talk more about Guatemala. What happened was in the 1950s, Guatemala elects President Arbenz, and he is very anti-American enterprise in Guatemala. He has reason to be because the United Fruit Company is the largest landowner in Guatemala, and you guessed it, it's an American company. They export fruit. They do not have to pay taxes in Guatemala. They are basically exploiting Guatemala. And so when he goes to enact land reform in Guatemala and give people back the use of their land, the United States goes in to protect its economic interests. And we've got a plane over here showing the United States literally flying in propaganda, dropping it on Guatemalans in order to kind of sway them against their newly elected leader. They also are inspired to have a CIA government takeover. It doesn't work very well, but it's really pretty ballsy of the United States to try to intervene in a country that blatantly. They were not exactly being subtle about it whatsoever. the Middle East. Again, we're going to look at some consequences of Western influence here. Two ideologies that unite the Middle East would be Pan-Arabism and a little bit of just nationalism for these countries. So, number one, Pan-Arabism is going to unite those countries you see there in green, where we have like official Middle Eastern identity, connecting them through their Arab culture and heritage. Egypt comes under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser. And what he does in the 1950s is he takes back the Suez Canal. He brings that under Egyptian control. And this prompts the British and the French to invade Egypt. It's one of the first crises that the UN is involved in as far as peace negotiations, and the United Nations is going to be in charge of trying to bring that back into some sort of understanding and get the canal to the point where it can be used by everybody. It could be that kind of water traffic highway that they intended it to be. Islamism. This is a nationalist movement to return to Islam only. So this is a direct consequence of Western influence. The best example we have of that is what happens to Iran. Prior to 1979, Iran was led by a very Western influenced leader. They had a monarchy in Iran established in the 1920s. And they were extremely influenced by Western ideals. So Iran had gone through this cultural transformation and economic one that angered a lot of people who wanted to go back to conservative Islam, but also get the Westerners out of Iran. So in 1979, they are going to depose their monarchy and create a very, very conservative government, so culturally conservative. After 1979, you've got a lot of laws coming into place in Iran where you're getting rid of women's rights. You are asking people to dress in a very culturally conservative way. And they are being directly led and influenced by Islam. If you want to take a look at kind of what we call the Middle East Cold War, it's kind of its own Cold War and issues caused by outside influence. You can go ahead and watch this video clip. So let's talk about communism in Asia. We have previously talked about China becoming a communist country in 1949, I believe, under the leadership of Mao Zedong. But what does that mean for other forms of communism in that continent? So I urge you to watch this video. It is a crash course U.S. history video, but it does give you some perspective as to why somebody like the United States, who has really honestly no motivation other than ideology to go into countries like Korea and Vietnam and get involved using their military. So by controlling these countries, they're not going to gain economically. There's really no way that they're increasing their empire. That's not what's happening. So go ahead and watch this video and ask yourself, why did the United States get involved in Korea and Vietnam after the Second World War? China. So let's look at how China implements communism throughout the few decades after the Second World War. while they have a few different economic and cultural policies that they're going to do to implement a lot of change. So the first one is the first 5-year plan in 1955. If you're thinking this is a direct ripoff of the Soviet Union, you would be correct. They have basically Soviet-sponsored industrialization happening. This is a fairly successful attempt to create more heavy industry in China. It doesn't go too bad. And so they kind of early on get inspired to go even further with the Great Leap Forward. However, the Great Leap Forward is absolutely disastrous. So in the Great Leap Forward, they are encouraging industrialization to a point where they are asking Chinese peasants to create steel in their backyards, in addition to their communal and collectivized farming that they had gotten into. They were also exchanging food for more industrialization with other countries like the USSR. And so they were they were causing a man-made famine in China, similar to Stalin's 5-year plan, that had a lot of consequences. We were talking about millions of people that starved to death during the Great Leap Forward. Because of the failure of the Great Leap Forward as far as killing millions of your population, Mao Zedong wants to, I guess, make his image better, make China's culture better, to kind of make people forget about that failure. And so he's going to get rid of everything traditionally Chinese. They are, that's out. They want ideological purity. No other types of thoughts, especially anything that could be traditionally Chinese or capitalist. Gone. Out. And so this is a good time period here where they are kind of at the expense of the population. People are still dying during the Cultural Revolution. They are trying to evolve China's image. After Mao Zedong's death, there's still not a whole lot of change as far as communist ideals. The best example of that would be in 1989, the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy rallies led by mostly students who had been educated about other 1980s revolutions and rallies and protests for democracy, especially in the Soviet bloc. And many of them were massacred during those rallies. That kind of leads to that famous picture down there at the corner of the man holding his shopping bags while stopping a bunch of tanks. Go ahead and watch this crash course world history on how China industrializes. It's going to talk to you a little bit about China's revolution that happened in the 1940s, but also what do they do once they become this new communist government. So let's look at that big picture really quick here. We've got brand new independent countries. Many of them had to fight to become independent. Some of them negotiated fairly peacefully. How were they going to establish a new government, or where would they take their country economically? Would that be through democracy and capitalism, or would that be through communism, socialism? What would that look like? Who are they forming alliances with? As a brand new country, you do have to have some friends in the world. And are you joining a side in the Cold War? Many new countries did. Some of them chose that third path where they were not. Many countries like the United States, the Soviet Union, and China become involved in civil wars outside of their own borders, regional wars like the Korean Peninsula, like Vietnam, that we're calling proxy wars. They don't have anything to do with what's going on in the Soviet Union or the United States, but yet they are endorsing wars for their own gain, mostly to preserve their ideological goals of spreading communism or containing communism. So that's it for chapter 37. We are going to have a little check-in quiz, the same that we did with chapter 36. Go ahead and do that and write your reflection and get that turned in as well. Pretty straightforward week. And I'll talk to you in another video soon.